All vices are born from pride, and it is also the mother of loneliness. Michel de Montaigne. Pride is not just a character trait or a moral flaw. It's a thin crack in the mirror of the soul, an almost invisible web that wraps around a person's psyche and shapes a distorted perception of themselves. Its growth can be compared to an invisible architecture, where every link, every brick is laid under the influence of inner anxieties, external pressure, and neurophysiological mechanisms. It begins unnoticed. A slight sense of superiority, a drop of self-satisfaction, conviction in one's own rightness. Let's recall those moments when pride in one's own achievement grows into something more: contempt for those who didn't make it, intolerance toward others' mistakes, the feeling that one person is allowed more than the rest. It can disguise itself as care, as confidence, or as professionalism, but at its root, there is always fear. Fear of being worse, of being rejected, of being insignificant. Pride becomes a shell protecting a fragile ego. So what is this voice that whispers, "You are better, you know more, you are above"? This voice seems internal, but in reality, it's a shadow, separating a person from others and at the same time from themselves. Pride doesn't just distort one's view of the world, it creates a new reality in which the person is the center of the universe and everyone else is just background. But what specific part of a person places themselves at the center of their own cosmos? Obviously not the hand, not the leg, not the stomach, not some single neuron, not a biological organ. A child is not born with pride, with a crown on their personality, which, by the way, doesn't even exist yet in the beginning. I mean personality. This center appears later in the form of the ego, and pride is the crown of the ego, a laurel wreath or an illusory halo above the ego. The ego represents our identity, how we perceive ourselves and our value. It is the part of the psyche that seeks confirmation of its own significance. Pride appears when the ego starts striving to confirm its exclusivity, which is expressed in the certainty of being right and superior to others. The ego wants to be better, more important, and strives to create an image that matches these ideas. And pride is often a defensive reaction of the ego to a threat or doubt about its own worth. When a person feels that their significance or success is being questioned, the ego can respond with excessive pride to regain a sense of control. This creates an illusion of strength and confidence, protecting a person from inner anxieties and fears, such as insecurity or feelings of inferiority. Inferiority. That is the root cause of pride. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. At first glance, pride may seem like nothing more than inflated self-esteem, but at its core, there is often hidden insecurity. Psychologists say that the lower a person's real self-esteem, the more they need external confirmation of their worth. In this case, pride acts like armor hiding vulnerability, social comparison, constant need for recognition, fear of rejection. All of this triggers a defensive reaction. The American psychologist Carl Rogers wrote, "The more a person feels threatened in their self, the more strongly they distort reality to protect their self-concept." To understand the origins of pride, it's important to look deep into the psyche and the brain. Modern research in neuroscience and psychology sheds light on the mechanisms behind this feeling, revealing the deep biological roots of pride in the human psyche. Neurophysiologically, it is connected to the dopamine system, responsible for the sense of reward. When a person feels superior to others, when they feel their own supremacy, the brain's reward centers light up. In particular, that very dopamine system that reinforces the pursuit of success. It's the same system that activates when receiving a reward or praise. That's why it's called the pleasure center. Over time, the brain learns feeling superior equals pleasure, and that's how dependence on pride is formed. Scientist Kaisi Izuma in 2008 conducted a study showing that social recognition activates the same brain areas as material rewards. Thus, the feeling of superiority literally brings pleasure, and like any pleasant stimulation, it can create addiction. when a person starts valuing not the process of growth itself, but only the feeling of their own superiority. Moreover, as noted in studies of the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for self-evaluation and social perspective, people with pronounced pride show increased activity there. This confirms the link between cognitive processing of social information and the formation of a sense of personal exceptionalism. In other words, pride is closely tied to cognitive processes aimed at perceiving oneself in society. By the way, this is also one of the reasons cults appear when the dopamine system, in the absence of self-reflection, inflates the leader's self-esteem, making them dopamine-dependent, unreasonable, and sometimes destructive. When the ego becomes too domineering, it overshadows the true self, our authentic essence. This is a natural process of socialization. Every person carries pride in one form or another. The degree of its manifestation depends on the maturity of the subject. A person can be more humble, open, and receptive, while an ego filled with pride and arrogance creates an illusion of independence and infallibility. Pride arises when a person loses connection with this true self and orients themselves exclusively toward the ego and its needs. From an evolutionary point of view, pride can be seen as a survival mechanism. In primitive societies, dominance in a group increased the chances of access to resources, partners, and safety. American biologist Robert Trivers noted that pride is also linked to mechanisms of self-deception that allow people to appear confident and competent in the eyes of others. This evolutionary advantage enabled leaders to form coalitions, manipulate public opinion, and promote their interests, even when their real competence didn't match the claimed qualities. Research in social neuroscience also shows that pride can be a strategy of social competition. Franz de Waal, the primatologist, notes that in chimpanzees, dominant individuals often display behavior similar to human pride. They use demonstrative gestures to assert their status and suppress competitors. This behavior echoes the theory of social dominance, according to which people unconsciously strive to occupy a higher position in the hierarchy. Once again, each of us unconsciously strive for a higher position among others, and that is a natural process. Nevertheless, pride also has negative evolutionary consequences. Excessive sense of self-importance can lead to conflicts, isolation, and even the destruction of communities. In modern society, it can manifest as narcissism, leading to emotional burnout, broken social bonds, and inability to accept constructive criticism. But all of this brings us to the main point. Pride is not formed in a vacuum, not in isolation, but in a social context. Society creates a system of evaluation in which a person constantly compares themselves to others. Ratings, likes, titles, status. All of this creates an environment where the sense of one's own importance becomes a way of survival. Pierre Bourdieu wrote about symbolic capital that reinforces inequality and the feeling of superiority in some and inferiority in others. Social media has amplified this phenomenon many times over. Today, anyone can construct an image embellished with filters and achievements. A person sees others' victories and, so as not to feel worse, begins to exaggerate their own significance. In this world of success and showcase happiness, pride becomes both a protective mask and a trap. In group dynamics, pride becomes a tool of power. People with status often convince themselves of their own exceptionalism, which leads to ignoring others' points of view. In collective systems, corporations, academic environments, political structures, pride can become systemic. A person at the top of the hierarchy, surrounded by deference, loses the ability to self-criticize. History knows many examples of rulers and leaders whose pride led to catastrophes. For example, Louis XIV, King of France, imagined himself the embodiment of the state, which led to the depletion of the treasury and popular unrest. Napoleon Bonaparte, blinded by his own infallibility, failed to recognize his mistakes in time, ultimately leading to his defeat. Adolf Hitler, driven by delusions of grandeur, ignored strategic realities, accelerating the collapse of the Third Reich. Yet society can also become a tool to combat pride. Cultures based on collectivism often develop mechanisms to restrain individual vanity. In Buddhist monasteries, practices of humility aim at realizing the illusoriness of the ego. In Eastern traditions, the importance of family and community reduces excessive self-conceit. In everyday life, pride seeps into the smallest aspects, making a person blind to their own actions. It shows up in the refusal to admit a mistake. The person stubbornly stands their ground even when facts say otherwise. Intolerance to criticism. Any remark is taken as a personal insult. The desire to prove superiority in conversation, at work, in daily life. The person strives to show they are smarter, more experienced, better. Disdain for others' efforts. The tendency to consider one's own work more significant than others. The need for the last word. In an argument, the person feels they must put the final full stop to affirm their opinion. Condescending attitude toward others, looking down on people with less experience, knowledge, or success. All these manifestations are rooted in a deep fear of being insignificant. Pride compensates for insecurity, creating an illusion of control and superiority. Pride can be broken down into several interconnected elements. It affects the whole being. Emotional aspect. The experience of one's own exceptionalism that feeds the dopamine system. It gives a fleeting sense of power and importance. Cognitive aspect. Subjective perception of oneself as more valuable than others. It forms the belief in personal exceptionalism and distorts perception of others. Social aspect. Affirming one's significance through interaction with others in society forces comparison and hierarchization, dividing people into better and worse. Neurophysiological aspect, reinforced by dopamine, forming the habit of self-assertion. Energetic aspect, the process of accumulating and expending psychic energy, where pride acts as a factor that closes a person off from the flow of change. And the existential aspect, pride as a form of resistance to accepting one's own limitation and finitude. It becomes a support in the struggle against inner emptiness. The key to overcoming pride in this context is awareness of its structure. When a person becomes aware of all aspects of pride within themselves, they can manage its manifestations instead of being its victim. Scientists view pride as a dual phenomenon. On one hand, healthy pride contributes to self-respect and motivation. On the other, excessive pride leads to cognitive distortions, including the Dunning-Kruger effect, when people with low competence overestimate their abilities. Research by Jessica Tracy from the University of British Columbia showed that there are two types of pride: authentic, based on real achievements and inner dignity, and hubristic, based on arrogance and the desire for dominance. Spiritual traditions warn of the destructive influence of pride. In Christianity, pride is considered one of the deadly sins leading to downfall. St. Augustine wrote, "Pride turned angels into demons. Humility makes men like angels." The Buddha taught, "Do not stand over others in pride, for your achievements are only temporary." In Islam, the Prophet Muhammad said, "Whoever has even an atom of pride in his heart will not enter paradise." Lavender warned, "The higher a person places himself, the harder his fall will be." Let's sum it up. How does pride originate? What is the path from vulnerability to arrogance? The algorithm is often invisible, but let's put it under the microscope. A person encounters evaluation or comparison. Anxiety arises. I'm not enough. I'm unworthy. Or the ego's defense kicks in. The desire appears to prove one's significance, to actualize oneself. If it succeeds, a dopamine surge happens in the brain from the feeling of superiority. The belief forms, I'm better, they don't understand. Behavior becomes demonstrative, conflict, prone. The environment either supports or rejects. A model of a proud self-image consolidates, often detached from reality. In Milos Forman's film Amadeus, exactly this dynamic of pride unfolds in the character of Salieri. An inner sense of personal mediocrity gives birth to painful envy, which pours out into a destructive form of pride and ultimately into tragedy. How can you recognize pride? It doesn't appear right away. Its signs can be mistaken for confidence, but over time they become noticeable. Heightened sensitivity to criticism, the desire to prove one's rightness at any cost. Inability to admit a mistake, subtle or overt belittling of others. Isolation, I'm not like everyone else. The famous scene from The Devil Wears Prada shows how outward superiority can hide deep inner anxiety. Meryl Streep's character lives in a world where status matters more than humanity, and any weakness is unacceptable. What are the consequences of pride? At first glance, it seems useful. It helps maintain status, win arguments, achieve ambitions. But its consequences are devastating. On the psychological level, a person drifts away from their authentic essence, loses flexibility of thinking, sinks into loneliness and conflict. On the neurophysiological level, elevated stress, emotional exhaustion, rigid neural patterns that block openness, learning, and empathy. On the social level, destruction of trust, alienation, aggression, or manipulation. Thus, pride is not just an emotion. It is a multi-layered system formed simultaneously by psychology, neurophysiology, and culture. To see it, you need to look more closely at yourself and at the stories of others. As Albert Camus wrote, the hardest thing is not to defeat others, but to keep yourself from rising above them. So how do we overcome it? First, sincerely recognize its presence without excuses. Second, remind yourself that the world does not revolve around one person, around me. That everyone lives in their own truth, in their own picture of the world, and that picture is no less important. Third, allow yourself to be vulnerable. Admitting weakness is not defeat, it is the path to genuine strength. Pride may rise again, whispering that you know better. But if you learn to hear the silence behind its voice, you will find yourself in that silence. Meditation helps. To overcome pride, it's important to realize that our ego is not our essence. The ego is part of the personality, its center. Personality is an instrument of the subject. Who the subject is, that's another topic. This doesn't mean denying your personality, but rather understanding that your worth does not depend on external signs of superiority or social evaluations of the personality. The true self is connected to the inner world. It is neutral. From this comes humility, not domination over others. Pride arises when the ego steps forward, turning us into those who seek to rise at others' expense, creating barriers to genuine connection with people, not on the level of masks, but on the level of the soul. Pride is not the enemy. It is a shadow pointing to what in us needs attention, love, and healing. And perhaps it is precisely the path to genuine honesty with oneself, a bridge to the self.